In today's video, we're going to make a set-in sleeve sweater on the knitting machine. We're going to do this in 4 separate panels for the front and the back that we sew together down the front, 2 set-in sleeves with shoulder and armhole shaping, and a V-neck neck hole. I made this project with the Yarn Bee by Simply Flawless. So let's get started. Let's begin the sleeve by casting on with waste yarn 28 stitches. And then do 5 or 6 rows of waste yarn. Cut the waste yarn, and then leaving a very long tail in the center, do 10 rows of your main color. I've done my 10 rows, and now on the 11th row, I'm going to begin doing the rib. Knit your first stitch, and then do the rib on the second stitch. And then we're going to keep going. We're going to skip the next one. We're going to focus on this one. Okay, and we're going to pick all the way down to 1 stitch past the waste yarn. So this is my first loop of waste yarn, and this is my first stitch. So again, I want to make sure I get those purls on the first stitch, so that when I bind off, this rib actually has some stretch, so you can put the sleeve on over your hand and wrist. And we're just going to continue doing this all the way to the end. Just make sure that you end with a knit stitch, even if it means having to knit 2 stitches in a row. So I've finished all of my ribs, and the last 2 stitches I'm just going to knit without doing anything. Now I'm going to do an increase on either side on the 6th row 9 times. So the row we just did that created our rib is going to count as row 1. So now I'm up to row 2, 3, 4, 5. And the end of 5 is also going to count as the beginning of 6. So I'm going to begin doing my increase here. I'm going to do a very lazy increase. It does create a slight hole, but it's not going to be visible once I sew all my seams together. So I'm actually just going to go 1 pin longer than what I need, and that's just going to be my increase for row 6. Like I said, this is a very, very, very lazy way to do an increase. There's row 6. And as I do this, to keep track, I'm going to write down a 1. I'm going to write down every single time I do an increase, just so that I don't lose track. So that was row 6. Now I'm back to row 1. And these lazy increases, they do kind of get caught, so just make sure you push them down. So that was 1, 2, 4, 5. Again, I'm at the end of 5, so I'm just going to go 1 pin further, and this is going to count as my 6. Put 1 pin further there as well. So now I'm going to write down the number 2. Now I'm going to do my counting again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now I can do my increase again. So this is row 6. So that is my 3rd increase, and I'm going to write that down. And I'm going to continue doing this until I've done 9 increases total. I'm up to my last increase, and I just want to show you what's going to happen here. So this is row 5 of the increase row that I did for number 8. So I want to get this pin as my next increase, but I want to make sure that this pin doesn't rise. And this is very close over here, so the machine is going to rise this up. So I'm going to keep my eye on this pin, and the moment I see this start to rise, I'm just going to manually flip this under. So I'm just going to turn a little, and I'm just going to stop there, and I just flipped it under with my finger. And now I'm going to go back. So this is row 6, and this one's going to be really tight, especially since I just added a new stitch. So I'm watching this, but I want this pin to have a stitch. So let's see. All right, we're going to stop there because this is going to start to rise in about 1 second. So I'm just going to flip everything under manually and go back. So this is 1. So again, we need to just watch this pin so we can figure out when we have to just manually do this. I'm just going to do that and that. Here's 2. Here it comes again. Three. 4. 5. And I'm going to stop at the 5th stitch. Now we're going to begin doing the underarm shaping, and we're going to begin doing that by binding off 3 stitches on either side of the next 2 rows. So for our first 3 bind offs, we're going to do it on this row, go all the way to the end, and then at the beginning of the next row we'll bind off the next 3. So I'm going to unhook my yarn from the yarn guide, and I'm going to release around 3 or 4 stitches here. So 1, 2, 3. And using my crochet hook, I'm going to put the first stitch onto the crochet hook. I'm going to yarn over and pull it through. Then I'm going to put the next stitch onto my crochet hook. And I'm going to slip stitch these 2 together. This counts as my first bind off. So that's stitch 1. Stitch 1 actually requires 2 loops. Now we're going to take the next stitch and put it onto my crochet hook and bind those off as well. And that's now stitch number 2. And then I still need 1 more. So I'm going to advance the machine to get that last stitch. Get it onto my crochet hook. I'm doing yarn unders just because of the angle, it really doesn't matter. And that's my 3rd stitch. And I'm going to get this last pin to rise again. I'm just going to insert that loop over it, tighten it up, and I'm going to skip this stitch when I reinsert my yarn into the yarn feeder. So I'm just going to go like under this nook, insert it back, and I'm going to knit now to the end of this row. Now we need to do the 3 bind offs for the new row. So again, I'm going to release my yarn from the yarn feeder, and I'm going to have 4 stitches be released from the machine, or like 3.5. Okay, now from this angle I don't need to flip the machine around, so I'm going to take the first stitch and put it on my crochet hook, yarn over and pull it through, get the next stitch, yarn over and pull it through both. That is my first bound off stitch. Get the next stitch onto your crochet hook, yarn over, pull it through both. That's number 2. Now I'm going to advance this last stitch. Put it on my crochet hook, yarn over, and pull it through both of those stitches. And that's my 3 bound off stitches, and you can see the 3 bound off stitches right there. So now I'm going to crank this in reverse, put this back on the machine, tighten up the loop, flip this under the notch, put it back in the yarn feeder, and knit to the end of the row. This last stitch, just as a warning, this one might want to fall off, so get your loom pick handy just in case that happens. And it just did. And I'm just going to put this back onto the machine and just make sure all the teeth have caught it. Now we're going to bind off 2 stitches at the beginning of the next 2 rows. So I'm going to do the same exact thing, release the yarn from the feeder, and we're going to have to release 3 stitches this time, but I'm going to go for 2 just because I don't want anything else to fall off. I put the first stitch on my crochet hook, second stitch is on my crochet hook. So this is binding off stitch number 1. Now we're going to advance the machine. This is stitch number 2, so yarn over and pull it through both. Reverse crank and put this back onto the machine. Tighten it up. And now we're going to knit to the end. And again, just pay attention to that last stitch. Mine just popped off. That's okay. I'll just put it right back on. And now I'm going to bind off these 2. So I'm going to release this from the yarn guide. I'm going to have 3 stitches sink down. Let's see if we can just do all 3. Okay. So I'm going to have my crochet hook, put the first stitch on your crochet hook, yarn over, pull it through 1, next stitch on my crochet hook, yarn over, pull it through 2, that is binding off stitch number 1, and then the next stitch, yarn over, pull through those 2, that is stitch number 2. You're going to start to see this laddering effect, which is really cool. Now go in reverse, put this stitch back on, tighten it up, go under the notch right there, and we're going to knit to the end. Again, just be careful of this last one right here. Now we're going to decrease every other row twice. So I'm going to take this out of the yarn feeder and I'm just going to remove this stitch from the machine. And place it on top of the one next to it. And just make sure they both go all the way underneath all of the teeth. And that is the decrease on one end. Then we're going to go all the way to the last 2 stitches. We're going to do the same thing here. This one actually just popped off, which is fine. And we're just going to take this stitch, place it on top of the second to last pin right here, push it all the way down, and then just go to the end of the row. And now we're just going to do a regular knit row, and then we're going to do the decreases again. So I'm going to remove this from the machine. Place it on top of this stitch right here and push everything down. Put this back in the yarn feed. Make sure it's under that notch. We're going to go to the end of the row. to the last 2 stitches. This one right here, I'm going to take this off and put it on top of the pin right next to it, push everything all the way down and go to the end of the row. Now I'm going to knit 4 rows straight. 1, and just be aware of your edges here. We did do a lot of stitch moving around. That's 1, 2, 3. On the 4th row, I'm going to do another decrease on either end. So again, I'm going to remove this stitch, crank this up, place it on top of the stitch right next to it, place this under the nook and back into the yarn feeder, and we're going to go all the way to the last 2 stitches, which are right here. I'm going to grab this stitch, take it off, and place it on top of the pin right next to it and go to the end. And now we're going to knit 1 row flat. Now I'm going to do decreases on both ends every other row 6 times. So again, I'm going to remove this stitch, place this on top, go to the last 2, and do this decrease as well. Now, because I'm doing this 6 times, I'm going to write down my decreases. So I'm writing down the number 1. Now I'm going to knit flat for 1 row. And now I'm going to do my second decrease. So again, I'm going to remove this from that pin, advance the machine, place that on top, all the way down, put this back in the yarn guide, and go to the last 2 stitches. And do the decrease here as well. So that is decrease number 2. And now I'm going to knit flat. And now I'm going to do my 3rd decrease. And knit flat, this is my 4th decrease. Knit flat, Now my 5th decrease. Knit a row flat. And now my 6th decrease. Now I'm going to bind off 4 stitches at the beginning of the next 2 rows. So again, I've taken my yarn out of the yarn feeder and I'm going to bring down 4 stitches, but I'm really going to need 5. Got my first stitch on there, yarn over, pull it through. Second stitch, this counts as my first bound off stitch. I'm going to take the next stitch. This is my second bound off stitch, third, and this one is my 4th. I'm going to go in reverse to get this pin up, place that back on, slip this under the nook, and we're going to knit to the end. Take the yarn out of the yarn feeder, and again we're going to have around 4 stitches removed from the machine. So I'm going to get my crochet hook. All right, I had to flip around because it was just really hard reaching over the machine like that. So I've got my first stitch on here and I'm just going to yarn over and do a slip stitch. Second stitch on my crochet hook, and this is my first bound off stitch. The next one, second bound off stitch. This is my third, and this is my 4th. And now I'm just going to flip the machine around right side again. Go in reverse so that that pin can be caught. Knit to the end. And now I'm going to bind off these 10 stitches. So I'm just going to, and again, that last one always wants to fall off, and that's okay. Just make sure you catch it. Okay, and now I'm just going to bind these off the same way. So I'm going to yarn over for the first one. All right, and there is the last one. And I'm going to cut a fairly long tail, and I'm just going to bind this off. So here is the sleeve freshly off the machine. So I'm going to stretch it, tighten up the stitches. And then I will show you up close what all of this shaping actually looks like. Okay, so down here we have our rib for the cuff, which came out really nicely. And again, I went way past the waist yarn so that when I bind that off, I will have a very stretchy cuff. And then up here, where we did all of our decreases, here is our underarm and shoulder shaping. So this is the underarm part, and then this slopes up. This is the shoulder, and then it slopes again for the underarm. So this is going to fit really nicely into the main part of the sweater when we sew it all together. And once you put this together, you're not going to end up with the bunching under the arm that you get when you don't do any type of shaping. Also, this yarn came out really nice. I love the way that it did this self-striping, so I think I highly recommend this yarn. And we're going to move on to working on the main part of the sweater. Now we're going to make the back panel. We're going to make the back panel in 2 sections. It's going to be 64 stitches across, but I'm going to work each portion of that in half. So right now I'm going to cast on with waste yarn 32 stitches. And with your waste yarn, do 4 or 5 rows of waste yarn. Cut your waste yarn and release it into the center of the machine. Now get your main color and leave a really long tail in the center for binding off later. And we're going to do 10 rows that we're going to turn into a rib. I'm up to the row with my rib, which is going to count as row 11. So I'm going to skip the first pin and I'm going to go to the next one. Pull this stitch off the machine, unpick all of these stitches, and make sure you go all the way down to the waste yarn, which is right there, because I want to make sure that my rib row has actual stretch. If you don't go all the way down to the waste yarn, you're actually going to create a rib with one final bind off that's not stretchy. So I want to go all the way down. Skip the next stitch and go to the next one. I'm going to unpick all of these stitches, and again make sure you go all the way down to the waste yarn. So you see how I still have one there? Go one more, and then we're just going to work our way back up. We're just going to continue making this rib all the way to the end. Just make sure that you end with a knit stitch. And I'm just going to continue going to the end. I'm up to my last one because I don't want to end with a purl row. And so I don't mind that I'm going to have 2 knitted stitches next to each other because one of them is just going to end up in the seam anyway. And it's also very possible that the second one will be barely visible as well, or it'll be seamed up so neatly you're not even going to notice it. So this is my last row. Then I'm just going to crank to the end. I've finished my rib, so now I'm on row 11, and I'm going to do 70 rows total, including the 11 rows that I just did. So I'm starting on row 12. So for what I'm doing, I need to end with an even row because I want to begin doing all of my shaping on the right side right here. So I need to end on an even row. So I'm going to do this until I get up to the number 70. I've done my 70 rows, and now I'm going to bind off 3 stitches at the beginning of this row. So I'm going to release my yarn, and I'm going to release 4 stitches from the pins, like that. I'm going to insert yarn over, pull it through 1. So this is 1 bound off stitch, the second bound off stitch, and then the third bound off stitch. crank and reverse a little bit, and place that stitch on the pin. Tighten it up, flip this yarn under this notch, and we're going to knit to the end of the row. And then come back. And just keep an eye on this last stitch. It's very likely it's going to want to pop off. So let's see. It's okay. Just pop it right back on. And that's our first row of binding off. Now I'm going to bind off 2 stitches at the beginning of this row. And again, make sure you do all your bind offs on one side. The other side is going to be flat because you're going to make 2 of these and you're going to sew them together. So I'm binding off 2 stitches, which is going to require 3 actual pins. So I've just released 3 stitches here. Yarn over and pull that one through. This one doesn't really count as anything. Now the next stitch, this is 1 bind off. And then the next stitch, that's our second bind off. Crank and reverse, put the stitch back on the machine, tighten it up, flip the yarn under this notch, do not knit that stitch, and knit to the end. And then come back. And again, we want to watch for that last stitch because most likely it is going to want to pop off. And it just did. And just go to the end. Now we're going to do a decrease. So again, we're going to take this out of the machine, remove this first stitch, crank a little so this pin raises up, place that stitch on top of that one, flip this yarn under the notch here because that's going to count as our new row, and then knit to the end. And then come back. Now we're going to do a decrease again. So remove this from the machine, take this stitch off, turn the crank for this one to raise, place this stitch on top, push everything far down, flip this yarn around the knot, put it back in the yarn feeder, and then knit to the end. And then come back. Now I'm going to do the armhole. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to do 20 rows flat, but you can do this however long you need this to be. This is just going to require swatching on your part to figure out how long your armholes need to be. So I'm just going to do 20 rows without any shaping at all. I've done my 20 rows of armhole shaping, and now I'm going to bind off 5 stitches at the beginning of this row. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not going to release too many stitches from the machine at the same time, just as insurance, because I don't want anything to fall off by accident. So just be mindful of that. So here's my first stitch bound off. My second stitch bound off, my third stitch bound off, fourth stitch bound off, and my fifth stitch bound off. Go in reverse, put this back on the machine, tuck this under the notch next to it, put this back in the yarn guide, and then knit to the end. And then knit back. And just be careful of that last stitch because it is going to pop off. And now I'm going to cast off another 5 stitches. So here we go. The first stitch is just that slip stitch, that doesn't count. Second stitch. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Crank and reverse and put the stitch back on the machine and then knit to the end. And then come back. And again, we're watching that last stitch, which just popped off. So this leaves me with 15 stitches, and now I'm just going to bind them all off, and that's the end of the first side of our panel. Now, I'm not going to release all of these stitches at the same time. I know I did that with the sleeve video. I don't really recommend doing that because you do run the risk of all your stitches falling off by accident, so I'm just going to do a few at a time. But I am just going to bind all of these off, and then we'll take a look at what we have created. And there is our bind off. Cut a reasonably long tail and then just secure this last stitch. So here is the first half of our front panel completed. So I'm just going to give it a stretch to tighten up my stitches. And you can see down here we have a really nice tight looking rib. And you can see up here the shoulder shaping and the armhole shaping that our sleeve is going to fit into. And now we're going to make the other half of this, and we're going to do this the same exact way, but a mirror image of it. So I did all of my decreases on the right side. Now I'm going to do all my decreases on the left side. If you don't do it like that, you're going to end up with one half is going to be inside out. So just please, please, please be mindful of which side you're doing as you go along. So now we're going to begin the other side of the panel. So I'm going to set this up the same exact way as I did on the previous side. So I'm going to cast on 32 stitches with waste yarn. I'm going to do 5 or 6 rows of waste yarn, cut the waste yarn and put it in the middle of the machine. Now I'm going to again put a long tail in the center with my main yarn, and I'm going to do the rib exactly the same way as I did on the previous video. So I'm going to do 10 rows, and on the 11th row I'm going to turn it into a rib. So I've completed my rib and I've done 70 rows, but I need to make this 71 rows so that my working yarn is on the left side of the panel. So I'm going to make this 71. Now I'm going to do all my decreases and bind offs on the left side. So I'm going to begin by binding off 3 stitches. So I'm going to do the same exact thing that I did on the other side, but over here. So I'm releasing these stitches. Do a slip stitch for 1. This is our first bind off. can bind off. And then our third bind off. Crank the machine in reverse and place this stitch onto the pin. Doing the same exact thing, but in the opposite direction. So slip that stitch down, flip this yarn under that notch, and then we're going to knit to the end. And then come back. And just like before, we need to pay attention to this last stitch. Now I'm going to bind off 2 stitches. So again, I'm going to release the yarn, and I need 3 stitches off the pins. I'm going to do a slip stitch for the first one. And that's 1. And that's 2. Reverse the machine, put this stitch back on that pin, flip it under the notch, and knit to the end. And then come back. Now we're going to do a decrease. So remove this. We're going to take this stitch off this pin, place it on top of the one next to it, push everything down, make sure this yarn flips behind that notch, and then knit to the end. And then come back. And now I'm going to decrease again. So I'm going to remove this stitch. Place it on top of the one next to it. Flip this yarn under that notch, put this back in the yarn feeder, and go to the end. And then come back. Now I'm going to knit 20 rows flat. I've done my 20 rows. Now I'm going to bind off 5 stitches. So there's my slip stitch. This is 1. 2, 3, 4, 5. Place the stitch back on, wrap this yarn underneath the notch, and knit to the end. And then come back. And now we're going to bind off the next 5 stitches. One, 2, 5. Reverse the machine and place that stitch back on, flip that under the notch, then knit to the end. And now we're going to come back. And this leaves us with 15 stitches. And now I'm just going to bind off these stitches, and then this half of the panel is completed. Cut a tail and then secure this stitch. So here's our second half of the back panel. So stretch this one out too. We have our shoulder shaping up here, and here is our armhole shaping. So now if you hold these two pieces together, you can see that when we sew it together down the middle, we're going to have the armholes for each side and the back and shoulder up there. Now we're going to begin making the front of the sweater. This is going to be a V-neck, and we're going to make this in a similar way that we made the back. We're going to make 2 panels and then sew them together. So first we're going to cast on 32 stitches with waste yarn. And then I'm going to do 5 or 6 rows of waste yarn. Cut the waste yarn and release it into the center of the machine. And then we're going to do the same thing that we did with the other panels. Put a long tail into the center. I'm going to do 10 rows that I'm going to turn into ribs, and then 70 rows total of flat knitting. So I'll come back to you after I've completed those. I've made my rib and I did my 70 rows. So now I'm going to do the same thing that I did on the other panels, where I'm going to do the shaping only on one side. But in this case, I'm going to do the armhole shaping on the left side, and I'm going to do the V-neck shaping on the right side. So on the left side, I'm going to bind off 3 stitches. So there are my 3 stitches bound off, and I'm going to put this back on the machine. And I'm going to knit all the way to the end here, but I'm going to stop on the last 2 stitches, because now on this side I'm going to begin doing my V-neck shaping. So I'm going to decrease 1 stitch every other row on this side, and then do the armhole shaping on the other side. So I'm going to do this 8 times, 8 decreases every other row. So I need to write these down. So I'm writing down a 1, and now I'm going to just knit back. Now I'm going to bind off 2 stitches. Put this back on the machine. And then knit to the end. Now I'm going to do my decrease, because that counted as my 1 row of not doing a decrease, because we're doing this every other row. So going to remove this stitch here. I'm going to place it on top of that one. Tighten it up, flip this under the notch. Put it in the tensioner, and then we're going to go to the end. But I've run out of yarn, so I just have to attach more yarn. I've reattached my yarn, and now I'm going to knit to the end of this row. And this is my second decrease. For the V-neck. Now I'm going to do a decrease on this side. This is the armhole side. This is going to get a little confusing, but it all just works out in the end. So this is my decrease. And go to the end. And now I'm up to my next decrease for the V-neck. So I'm going to remove this stitch, place it on top of the one next to it, tighten this up, and knit to the end. So that was my third decrease for the V-neck. Now I'm going to decrease again on this side. This is the armhole side. So I'm going to remove this stitch. Place it on top of the one next to it. And knit to the end. Now I'm going to do my next V-neck decrease. This is the fourth one. And I'm also going to do those 20 rows of the armhole shaping, which we did for the back. So we're only going to do decreases on the V-neck side. So this is row 1. So there's a couple of things I have to keep track of now. I have to keep track of my V-neck decreases and my armhole rows. So this is row 4 of the V-neck and row 1 of the 20. Now I'm just going to go back. This is row 2 of the 20. And now stitch 5 of my decreases. This was now row 3 of the 20. And now I'm going to go back. This is row 4 of the 20. And now I'm up to decrease number 6 for the V-neck. And that is row 5 of the 20. Now we're up to row 6 of the 20. And I'm up to stitch number 6 of my V-neck decreases. So this is the 6th decrease, 7th row of the 20. This is row 8 of the 20. And decrease number 7. we're up to row 9. And I'm up to my 8th decrease. And that was my 10th row. There's one thing I forgot to mention, and I apologize for this. Once you start doing your V-neck decreases, just put a stitch marker in the first decrease. This is going to be helpful later on for when you have to line everything up. I finished my V-neck decreases and I just did row 11 of the armhole. So now I'm up to row 12. And there's a couple of things that I'm going to have to write at the same time. So I'm keeping track again of those armhole rows, the 20 rows that I'm still doing. Begin row 12. And I'm also going to do a V-neck decrease every 4 rows. So this is row 12 and row 1 of those 4 rows. So I'm writing down 12 and I'm writing down a 1. This is row 13 and row 2. So I'm writing 13 and row 2. This is row 14. This is 14 and row 3. And now I'm up to 15 and the first of those 2 decreases that I was talking about. So I'm going to write down 15 so I don't forget. And I'm also on row 4, so I'm going to take this stitch and flip it onto the one next to it. And that's my first of those 2 decreases. So I'm going to write a 1 for the decrease, and that was row 4. So now I'm up to row 1 of the new set of decreases and row 16. So this is 1 and 16, so that's 1 and 16. If you write it down, it's not nearly as confusing as it sounds. This is 17 and row 2. So I'm writing down 17 and 2, 18 and 3. So this is 18 and 3. And now this is 19 and 4. So I'm going to do the decrease. So that was 19 and 4. So I did my 2 decreases, and now I'm just going to knit back for row 20. And now I'm up to my last set of bind offs. I'm going to bind off 5 on one row and then 5 on the next, and then I'm done with this part of the panel. So I'm going to slip stitch my first, and then I'm going to bind off 5. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Go in reverse, put this back on the machine, and knit to the end. And now we're going to knit back, and now we're going to bind off another 5. Slip stitch the first, and then we bind off 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Put this back on the machine and knit to the end. And now we're going to bind off these remaining stitches. Remove it from the machine and let's see what we have. Cut a tail and secure this end. Okay, and now I'm going to stretch this out to see what we have. So here's our rib at the bottom. Here we have our V-neck shaping, which begins right where that stitch marker is. And then over here we have the armhole shaping. You can see that this is an exact mirror of what we made for the back. So now we're going to do this all over again on the opposite side. So cast on with your waste yarn the 32 stitches. You're going to do the 10 rows of rib and then the 70 rows total until the shaping and the V-neck. And I will come back to you when I'm ready for those steps. I've finished my rib and my 70 rows. So I'm going to begin my V-neck shaping over here. So I'm going to take my first stitch, because now I'm doing the opposite version of everything. I'm going to put that stitch here, and I'm going to crank to the end of the row with my first of my 8 decrease stitches. And we're going to just knit to the end. And now on this side, we're going to bind off 3 stitches. So this is just a mirror image of what we did in the previous panel. So we're going to slip stitch the first. So there are my first 3 stitches bound off on this side. I'm going to put that back on the machine, and now I'm going to knit to the end. Now I'm up to my second decrease on this side. So I'm going to remove this stitch, place it on top of this one, and I'm going to knit to the end. So that was my second V-neck decrease. And now I'm going to bind off 3 stitches again. And then put this back on the machine. And crank to the end. Now I'm up to my third decrease for the V-neck. So I'm going to take this stitch, and then crank to the end. So that's my third V-neck decrease. And now on this side, I'm going to bind off 2 stitches. So there's 1 and 2. Put that back on the machine and crank to the end. Now I'm up to my 4th V-neck decrease. So I'm going to do that now. and then crank to the end. And now on this side, the armhole side, I'm going to do 1 decrease. And then knit to the end. I'm up to the part where I need to do my 20 rows of armhole shaping and continue doing my decreases at the same time. I'm going to have 2 columns written out. I have my column with my V-neck decreases, and now I'm going to have a column for my 20 rows. So I'm already up to my 5th V-neck decrease. So I'm going to do that right now. So that's number 5. I'm going to write that down. And now I'm going to go to the end of the row. And that's going to count as row 1 of my 20. Now I'm on row 2 of my 20. So I'm going to write down a 2. And now I'm up to number 6 of my V-neck. And again, this sounds like a lot of numbers, but if you just write 2 columns, it's pretty easy to keep track of. So this is number 6. I'm going to write down 6. And this is row 3 of the 20. So I'm going to write down a 3. Now this is row 4 of the 20. And this is going to be number 7 of the V-neck. This is 7 of the V-neck and 5 of the 20. This is 6 of the 20. And now I'm up to number 8 of the V-neck. So this is 8, and that's now row 7 of the 20. And I forgot to put my stitch marker at the beginning of my decreases. So just again, make sure you put your stitch marker on that first row of decreases you do for the V-neck. Now I'm going to knit back. This is row 8 of the 20. And I'm also going to do a decrease every 4 rows, so that counts as row 1 of the 4. Now this is row 2 of the 4 and row 9 of the 20. So this is 2 and 9. Now this is row 3 of the 4 and 10 of the 20. So this is 3 and 10. And now I'm up to row 4. So I'm going to do another decrease right here. So this is 4. And this is row 11 of the 20. So I'm going to write down 11. And now I'm back to row 1 of the 4. So 1 of the 4, 12 of the 20. 2 of the 4, 2 of the 4, 13 of the 20. 3 of the 4, 3 of the 4, 14 of the 20. And now we're going to do our decrease again. And that is 15 of the 20. I'm going to just do 16 to just get myself to 20, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. Now we're going to just knit to the end here where our armhole shaping is. And now I'm going to bind off 5 stitches. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we're going to put that back on the machine. And then knit to the end. Then we're going to knit back. And now we're going to bind off the next 5. So this is our slip stitch. One, 2, 3, 4, 5. Crank and reverse, put this back on, knit the last 2, come back, and then bind these off as well. And there it is. And here is this side of the panel finished. So we have, again, the shoulder shaping is up there. We have our armhole over here. And then our V-neck begins over there. I wanted to show you the 2 panels next to each other, that this is why I put these 2 stitch markers here, because this shows where the V-neck is going to be. And then you're going to stitch this all the way down. Now I'm going to show you how we're going to bind off. So I'm going to do a stretchy bind off, so I'm going to use circular knitting needles, and I'm going to pick up all the stitches on my rib. So I'm going to do that by inserting the hook into each stitch. And I have 28 stitches, so just make sure you have 28 stitches on your needles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There they all are on my needles. So now I can remove this waste yarn. So I've removed my waste yarn. Just go through and make sure that you do not have any dropped stitches. So now I'm going to begin doing my stretchy bind off. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to knit wherever I see a knit, and I'm going to purl wherever I see a purl. So I'm going to begin with a knit. I'm going to yarn over and then do, this is another knit, and I'm going to pass both the knitted stitch and the yarn over, and pass both over. Yarn over and make a knit, pass both over. Yarn over and knit, pass these 2 over, yarn over and purl, over, and knit, pass it over. I'm just going through the back loop for the stitches that are twisted around. And that's what this is starting to look like, and you can see it stretches. And there's one sleeve bound off with the stretchy bind off. And then you're going to do this to every single panel that you've made so that you have a stretchy bind off. Now we're up to seaming all the panels together. So I've bound off my two back panels, and you can see how nice and stretchy this bind off is right here. And now I'm going to put these two pieces together using the mattress stitch. Line up your two pieces together and make sure you have your armholes facing on the outside. So we're going to do this wrong side up. So having the two right sides together, I have a bunch of stitch markers here. I'm going to line up my bottom stitches, and I'm going to start putting in stitch markers, which is going to hold everything together. And I try to do this piece by piece. So here's my rib. I want to make sure my rib is lined up. So I'm going to place a stitch marker between the two ribs. And now I'm going to go all the way up to my top. And I want to make sure that my top is lined up as well. So here's my top. I'm going to put a stitch marker here. And then I'm going to just start rolling my stitches, because again, they're going to want to curl. And just around every 10-15 rows, place a stitch marker, because that will just hold everything together for you. I've placed stitch markers across the whole thing. So when this is put together correctly, this is roughly what the piece would look like. So I've placed all my stitch markers, they're on the opposite side, and now I've flipped this right side forward. So I've threaded a needle with a reasonably long tail of yarn, and I'm going to insert this into one side and then into the other. This is just to create a join. And just leave a tail so that nothing falls out. And now I'm going to start putting this together. So I'm going to pick through here and find the first ladder, which is in between these two stitches. It's actually the purl bump on the opposite side. So I'm going to secure this by inserting that tail through my loop like that. And then I'm going to look for the purl bump on the opposite side, which is right there. And then going forward, I'm going to look for the two ladders, one above the other, like that. And then two ladders on the other side, like that. And we're just going to go back and forth like this all the way up, and it brings the whole piece together in a really nice invisible join. And you just have to pick in between the rows of stitches. You can see how it starts to, so this is like our purl ridge right here, and then this just kind of closes together. And I just want to show you what happens once we're past the rib. So now I'm up to my stocking knit, and I'm looking at this first row here. And there is where my seam is, and on the opposite side it does create obviously a visible seam. And we're just going to go all the way up, and we're going to do this with all of our panels. I've sewn all of my panels together. So here is my front panel. This is the V-neck here. It's sewn down the front with my mattress stitch. I have all of my bindings done. I've also inserted one of the sleeves so that you can see what this seam and this sleeve will look like. And I've also put my back panel together over here. Now we're going to focus on sewing the shoulder pieces together. The way we do this is having the wrong sides facing out. I'm putting the V-neck top on top of the back panel. And you see these ladders here of where we did all of our decreases. They match over here as well on the back panel. So I'm going to line these up, and I'm going to use stitch markers to hold them in place so that I can sew them together. So there are the two pieces held together with the stitch markers, and now we're going to use the mattress stitch to put them together. I've threaded a needle with a fairly long tail, and I'm going to do this kind of from the inside out. So I'm going to remove my first stitch marker, and I'm going to go inside to the right side of these stitches, and I'm going to slip my needle between the V's so that we don't end up seeing the seam. So there's one on one side, and then I'm going to match it on the opposite side. Now I'm just going to stitch across, going into the top of those V's across. And this will create a seam that's only visible on the inside part of the sweater, not the outside. And we're just going to do this matching stitch for stitch across each other. And I'm just going to continue doing that all the way across. And there is the seam completed. This is the wrong side, and here it is on the right side. Now we're going to put in the sleeve. So here's my sleeve, and I have the top of the shoulder over here, and I'm going to fold this in half just to find the midpoint of that shoulder, and it's right there. So I'm going to insert a stitch marker there just so that I have that center point. Now I'm going to flip this around, and I have my sweater opened up. This is the whole armhole over there. So I want to put this together in sections. So I have the center point of the sleeve, and I know this is the center point because this is where I just did my seam, and I'm going to insert that stitch marker right there. So that is the exact center of the sleeve. Now I'm going to find my end point of all of the armhole shaping on both the sleeve and the sweater itself. So that's right here. And I'm going to insert a stitch marker over here in this corner. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So I'm going to find the ending of all this shaping, and this is when it just becomes straight. And I'm going to match that to the one on this side. I'm going to put a stitch marker. So now it looks like that. And now I'm going to just start easing in this sleeve into my armhole. So I'm going to just every 8 or 9 stitches, I'm going to insert a stitch marker to hold this all in place. So there's one side all put together, and now I'm going to do the same on this side. And there is the sleeve held together with the stitch markers. So I've cut a reasonably long tail of yarn here, and I'm threading my needle. And I'm going to do this in a similar way that I did the shoulders, because I don't want any seams visible on the outside. So I'm going to insert this on this side and on the opposite side. And I'm just going to go into these V's. And as you do this, as the curvature of the sleeve begins, you're going to notice there are parts where you can do the ladders like a mattress stitch, and parts where you have to do it like this. You just kind of have to go with whatever you're presented with as you're doing this. So right now I'm doing V's because that's what I'm able to do. And I'm just going to keep doing this all the way across the whole thing. Okay, so I finished sewing this sleeve in, and here it is on the correct side. So you can see that it seamed in there very nicely. It fit really well. I'm just going to tie this off, and then we're going to work on putting it all together. So here's the sweater completely spread out. Here's the back, the front, and the 2 sleeves put in. So now we need to seam the sleeves together and the sides. So I'm going to take the front and flip it over on top. And again, we're doing this inside out. And I'm going to find my seams. I highly recommend not just putting your stitch markers from the beginning to the end, just like how I did with the sleeve. You should find the most important like midpoints of certain sections and then take it from there. So my seam is important. I want to make sure that my rib lines up. So I'm going to put one there. This way, if there is like an odd stitch or two in excess, you can kind of ease it together a little bit. Okay. And then on the sleeve here, I want this rib to line up nicely. So I'm going to put one there. And now I'm just going to start straightening this out and put all my stitch markers. There's the sleeve with all the stitch markers, and now I'm going to do the side seam. Okay, and there's the side seam. So here's everything that I'm going to have to stitch up. So I'm going to start from the sleeve and go all the way down, and I'm going to do this on both sides. I'm going to use the same exact stitching method that I used for the sleeve. So again, just do the mattress stitch all the way across, and I'll come back when I'm done with doing both sides. I've finished all my seams, everything is put together, and here is the sleeve inserted. It went in really nicely. And here's the other side. It's hard to get a wide angle of the whole thing. There's my bottom, the rib, here's my V-neck. And this, I tried it on, it fits really nicely around the arm. There's no bunching. It just fits in a very nice, comfortable way. So now we're just going to do the V-neck ribbing. I'm going to weave in all the ends and then the whole thing is done. So now we're going to put the V-neck together. I'm going to put a stitch marker in the middle of the back. I'm going to put a stitch marker right in the middle of the point of the V-neck. I'm using number 8 circular needles. I'm going to flip this around, and now I'm just going to go around picking up stitches. And now I'm just going to go around the whole thing picking up stitches. So I'm at the stitch where the central point is, so I'm going to take that stitch marker out. I'm going to pull up a stitch. It's a little hard because it's right in the middle of that seam, but we'll get it. And then that stitch, we're going to put the stitch marker on it because we need to keep that as a freestanding stitch, which I'll show you when we actually start making the V-neck. So now I'm still just picking up my stitches. I've made it to this stitch marker. So I'm going to do one more picked up stitch in the middle of this seam. I'm going to place that stitch marker on that needle. And now I'm just going to do a knit purl rib until I get to that middle stitch marker at the point of the V-neck. So I'm just doing a knit purl all the way around, and I'll get back to you when I'm up to that midpoint. Okay, so I've gone from the halfway point to this center stitch that I marked. So I'm going to slip the stitch right before it and the one after knitwise like that. I'm just going to slip them. I'm going to knit the stitch right next to it, and then I'm going to go back, slide these 2 stitches over that knit stitch I just made. So we're just going to, it's a little tight, do that. Okay, and then you end up with this center point stitch. I'm going to take out this stitch marker and I'm going to put it in the new stitch I just made, and then I'm going to continue with my knit purl all the way around. And then when I get to that center point again, I'm going to do the same thing, which I'll show you when I get. I'm up to my second round of my knit purl. I'm going to do 3 rounds total of this neckband, so I'm just going to continue doing my knits and purls until I reach the center point. So this is round 2. I'm at my center point again, 1 stitch before the center point. I'm going to slide these 2 stitches onto the next needle knitwise. I'm going to knit the next stitch, and I'm going to pass these 2 stitches over that stitch I just made. Reposition my stitch marker. And then knit purl to the end. I'm up to the beginning of round 3. This is going to be my last round, and I'm going to just knit and purl until I get to that center point, and that'll be the last center point that I do. Here's my last center point that I'm going to do. So it's the stitch right before my stitch marker. Slip those 2 stitches off. Purl this one so that it matches the pattern. And then I'm just going to slide these two over. And then just continue in my pattern. And then I'm going to do the stretchy bind off when I get to the end of this round. I've finished my third round. I can take that stitch marker out, and now I'm going to do my stretchy bind off. So I'm going to knit one, I'm going to yarn over, purl the next, and then slide the knit and the yarn over the stitch I just made. So now I'm going to yarn over again. I'm going to knit. So you just knit wherever there's a knit and you purl wherever there's a purl. Slide these two over up to a purl. So I yarn over, purl, and then slide these two over. I do like having some stretch around the neck hole just so that it's easier to put over your head. Yarn over, purl, pass these two over, and I'm just going to continue doing this all the way around. Okay, and here is the V-neck completed. You can see my center stitch here. It's a nice stretchy bind off, and it came out really nice. So now I have like a million threads to sew in, so I will get back to you when this whole thing is cleaned up. Here's the whole sweater completed. So there's our V-neck, a really nice shoulder shaping, and all of my ends have been woven in. This was a really fun project. It was a little more advanced than the typical things that I've been doing on the knitting machine, and it really shows the power of this tool, that you can make some really advanced projects. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you make this project, please let me know. Bye-bye.